Kimber had exactly 3 rules for surviving life on Meridian 6. Keep your head down, keep your toolkit organized, and never, under any circumstances, trust the ventilation system in Sector 9. The 3rd rule had been earned through experience involving a face full of recycled air that smelled suspiciously like fermented Krelian fruit, and she had no intention of repeating that particular humiliation. What she hadn't accounted for, however, was rule number 4, which apparently should have been, watch out for alien children with climbing skills that would put a gecko to shame. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. The day started like any other rotation on the station, which is to say, it started with Kimber wrestling with a plasma conduit that had decided to leak at the most inconvenient angle possible. She was wedged between 2 cargo containers in the lower bay, her oversized hoodie collecting grease stains that would absolutely never come out, humming along to music only she could hear through her earpiece. The hoodie itself was a masterpiece of human engineering, soft gray fabric that had survived 3 years of station life, with a hood deep enough to actually be useful, and pockets that could hold half her toolkit. Station regulations technically frowned upon personal comfort items during work hours. Kimber's response to station regulations typically was to ignore them until someone with actual authority bothered to enforce them. So far, that hadn't happened, mostly because she was the only maintenance tech willing to crawl into the spaces that made other people claustrophobic. The cargo bay stretched out around her like a metallic canyon, crates stacked 3 stories high, creating shadows that the overhead lights couldn't quite penetrate. Somewhere above, the station hummed with the sounds of 1,000 species going about their business, completely unaware that their waste recycling system was held together by Kimber's spite and a truly impressive amount of improvised welding. She loved it down here. Quiet, mostly. No chattering tourists asking stupid questions about whether the artificial gravity would suddenly fail. No diplomats strutting around like their trade agreements were more important than functioning toilets. Just Kimber, her tools, and the honest work of keeping a space station from falling apart 1 bolt at a time. The Uxmori delegation had arrived 3 weeks ago, and the entire station had been walking on eggshells ever since. Not without reason, mind you. The Uxmori were predators in the most literal sense, feline creatures that stood upright, with sleek fur and shades of midnight blue and silver, retractable claws that could shred hull plating, and eyes that reflected light like polished mirrors. Their reputation preceded them. Warriors, hunters, a society built on strength and hierarchy, and about a dozen other concepts that made human diplomats nervous. Kimber had seen exactly 2 of them from a distance, and had thought, reasonably, that she'd continue to maintain that distance for the duration of their stay. The universe, as it turns out, had other plans. She was reaching for her micro-welder when she felt it, a tiny, deliberate tap on her back, right between her shoulder blades, precise enough that it couldn't be an accident. Kimber froze. Her mind ran through possibilities at light speed. Falling debris? No. Too controlled. Malfunctioning equipment? Wrong section. Space spider? Please, for the love of everything, not another space spider incident. She pulled out her earpiece, cutting off the music mid-verse, and slowly turned her head. 3 pairs of luminous eyes stared back at her from approximately knee-height. "Oh," Kimber said, with the tone of someone who had just discovered their day was about to get significantly more complicated. "You've got to be kidding me." They weren't kidding. The 3 Uxmori cubs sat in a row, heads tilted in perfect synchronization, studying her with the kind of intense focus usually reserved for scientists examining a particularly interesting bacteria sample. They were small, maybe the size of human 5-year-olds, with oversized paws they clearly hadn't grown into yet, and fur that looked impossibly soft in the dim cargo bay lighting. The one in front, slightly larger than the others, with distinctive silver markings on his face, made a sound. Not a growl, not the deep rumbling vocalization she'd heard from the adult Uxmori. This was more of a chirp, a questioning trill that seemed to ask, "Well, what are you?" "I'm busy," Kimber told them, as if they could understand her, as if explaining her work schedule to alien children was a reasonable response to this situation. "I've got conduits to fix. You should probably be with your, parents? Guardians? Whatever your people call them." The silver-marked one chirped again, and then, with absolutely no warning whatsoever, launched himself at her midsection. Kimber yelped, arms windmilling as she tried to catch him, but he didn't need catching. His claws, thankfully retracted, found purchase in the fabric of her hoodie, and he scaled her torso like she was a particularly interesting tree. The other two took this as an invitation, chittering excitedly as they followed suit. "No, no, no, absolutely not," Kimber protested, but her hands were occupied trying not to drop her plasma torch, and by the time she'd safely set it down, she had 3 alien cubs exploring her clothing with the determination of mountaineers conquering new peaks. The silver-marked one, apparently the leader of this expedition, reached her shoulder and immediately investigated the hood of her hoodie. He stuck his entire head inside, disappeared for a moment, then re-emerged with what could only be described as delight on his feline features. He chirped something that sounded distinctly triumphant to his companions. The second cub, smaller and more cautious, with darker fur and white-tipped ears, carefully climbed to Kimber's other shoulder. She moved with deliberate precision, testing each handhold before committing, and once she reached her destination, she simply sat there, watching Kimber's face with unblinking curiosity. The third, a rambunctious ball of energy with mismatched spots, had discovered her hoodie pocket and was attempting to stuff himself inside it, despite being slightly too large for the space. He was making pleased rumbling sounds that Kimber could feel vibrating against her ribs. "This is not happening," Kimber announced to the empty cargo bay. "I'm hallucinating. I breathed in something toxic from that conduit. This is a very vivid, very weird hallucination." The silver-marked cub responded by climbing into her hood and settling against the back of her neck, his warm weight pressing against her spine. Within seconds, she felt him start to purr, a sound like distant thunder mixed with a running engine, surprisingly soothing despite the absurdity of the situation. The cautious one on her shoulder leaned against the side of Kimber's head, tiny paws kneading the fabric of her hoodie with rhythmic precision. The purring intensified. The spotted troublemaker finally wedged himself successfully into her pocket, and immediately went still, his purring joining the chorus. "Oh, you cannot be serious," Kimber muttered, but she didn't move. Couldn't move, really, because some instinct she didn't know she possessed was screaming at her that disturbing sleeping babies was wrong, regardless of what species those babies belonged to. She stood there, in the middle of the cargo bay, covered in alien children who had apparently decided she was the universe's most comfortable napping spot. Her back was starting to ache from the awkward angle she'd been working at. She had 6 more conduits to repair before her shift ended. Her supervisor was going to have questions about her productivity reports, and 3 Uxmori cubs were purring against her like she was their favorite piece of furniture. "This is fine," Kimber told herself, settling carefully onto a nearby crate, moving with the kind of exaggerated caution normally reserved for bomb disposal. The cubs adjusted to her movement without waking, redistributing their weight like professional sleepers. "This is completely fine. Totally normal day at work." Nothing to worry about. She pulled out her communicator, thinking she should probably report this, then paused. Report what, exactly? That she'd been adopted by alien children? That she was now a mobile napping station? The station's security team was already stretched thin with the diplomatic delegation. They didn't need her adding to their workload over something that was, technically, harmless. The cubs were warm and surprisingly heavy, their purring creating a vibration that seemed to resonate through her entire body. It was oddly calming, in a weird way, like holding a cat, if that cat was an alien apex predator that would grow up to be nearly 3 times her size. 20 minutes, Kimber decided, putting her earpiece back in and queuing up her music at a lower volume. I'll give you 20 minutes to nap, then you're going back to wherever you came from. The silver-marked cub in her hood snored softly, his breath warm against her neck. Kimber sighed and got back to work, moving with careful deliberation, checking connections with one hand while her other arm supported the weight of the cub in her pocket. It was awkward, inefficient, and absolutely not covered in any station manual she'd ever read. 20 minutes turned into 30. 30 turned into 45. The cubs slept on, completely content, occasionally shifting to find more comfortable positions, but never actually waking up. Kimber found herself humming along to her music, occasionally glancing down to make sure her passengers were still breathing, which they definitely were, based on the continued purring that had become background noise to her work. She was investigating a particularly stubborn bolt when the cargo bay lights suddenly brightened, flooding the space with harsh illumination that made her squint. Footsteps echoed against the metal deck plating, multiple sets, moving fast. Kimber looked up to find 6 security officers standing at the entrance to her work area, weapons drawn but pointed at the ground, their expressions ranging from confused to terrified. Behind them stood the largest Uxmori she'd ever seen, easily 2.5 meters tall, with fur like polished obsidian and eyes that glowed with an intensity that made her survival instincts scream. He wore some kind of ceremonial armor that looked both decorative and terrifyingly functional, and his claws were very much not retracted. Next to him, looking like he was one bad decision away from a complete nervous breakdown, stood Commander Pollux, the station's highest-ranking official and the man who signed Kimber's paychecks. Everyone stared at her. Kimber stared back, very aware of the 3 alien cubs currently using her as a bed. The spotted one in her pocket chose that exact moment to wake up, yawn widely enough to show every single one of his needle-sharp baby teeth, and let out a sleepy chirp that echoed through the suddenly silent cargo bay. "So," Kimber said, with the calm of someone who had accepted that her day had officially gone completely off the rails. "I'm guessing these are yours." The silence that followed Kimber's question could have been weaponized. It stretched out like taffy, thick and uncomfortable, while every single person in the cargo bay tried to process the scene in front of them. Security officers with their hands twitching near their weapons. Commander Pollux, with his face doing an impressive impersonation of a tomato. And the massive Uxmori warrior, who hadn't moved a single muscle since laying eyes on Kimber and her passengers. The spotted cub yawned again, completely oblivious to the tension, and attempted to burrow deeper into Kimber's pocket. "Huntmaster Oxman," Commander Pollux said, his voice pitched slightly too high, the kind of tone that suggested he was using every ounce of diplomatic training to not panic. "I can explain this situation." "Can you?" The Huntmaster's voice was like gravel rolling down a mountain, deep and resonant, and carrying the kind of authority that made people stand up straighter without thinking about it. His eyes, still locked on Kimber, reflected the cargo bay lights like twin moons. because I find myself profoundly curious about what explanation could possibly suffice for this unprecedented scenario. Kimber felt the silver-marked cub in her hood stir, pressing closer against her neck. The cautious one on her shoulder remained perfectly still, but her claws had extended just slightly, pricking through the hoodie fabric in a way that wasn't painful, but definitely noticeable. "Right," Kimber said, because apparently her mouth had decided to operate independently of her survival instincts. "So, funny story. I was working, minding my own business, and these three just sort of appeared, climbed me, and then they fell asleep. I didn't want to wake them because that seemed rude, and honestly, they're kind of heavy, so moving wasn't really an option anyway." One of the security officers made a strangled sound that might have been a suppressed laugh or possibly the beginning of a breakdown. Hard to tell. "You didn't want to wake them," Oxmoon repeated slowly, as if testing the words to see if they made more sense the second time. They apparently didn't, based on the way his head tilted in what could only be described as profound confusion. Because it seemed rude. "Well, yeah." Kimber shifted her weight carefully, supporting the cub in her pocket with one hand. "They're kids, right? You don't wake sleeping kids unless there's an emergency. That's just basic courtesy." Commander Pollux closed his eyes and pinched the bridge of his nose, the universal gesture of someone whose day had spiraled so far beyond their pay grade that they were considering new career options. "Kimber, do you have any idea how much trouble the station has been in for the past 3 hours?" 3 hours. Kimber blinked, glancing at her chronometer. Sure enough, her 20-minute nap allowance had somehow expanded into a 3-hour sleeping marathon. "Oh, okay. That's longer than I thought." "Longer than you thought," Pollux repeated, and, yep, his eye was definitely twitching now. "The Uxmori delegation has been tearing this station apart looking for these cubs. We've had every available security officer on high alert. I've fielded 6 emergency calls from the council. The huntmaster was 3 minutes away from declaring a formal incident and potentially severing all diplomatic relations with humanity." "That does sound stressful," Kimber agreed, earning a glare from Pollux that could have melted hull plating. Oxmoon moved forward, suddenly his footsteps impossibly quiet for something his size, and the security officers tensed. But he wasn't reaching for a weapon. Instead, he stopped about 2 meters from Kimber and lowered himself into a crouch, bringing his face level with hers. Up close, she could see the intricate patterns in his fur, the slight graying around his muzzle that suggested age and experience, and the complete and utter bafflement in his eyes. "They climbed you," he said, not a question, but a statement, as if saying it out loud would make it make sense. "Yep, like little fuzzy ninjas." Kimber gestured vaguely at her hoodie. "This one found my hood and decided it was prime real estate. That one liked my shoulder. And Pocket Boy here seems to think I'm a mobile cave." The spotted cub, hearing himself referenced, chirped happily and stuck his head out of the pocket to look at Oxmoon. His tail, which Kimber had just noticed was wrapped around her belt loop, gave a little wave. Something happened to Oxmoon's expression then. The confusion didn't disappear exactly, but it shifted, mixing with something that looked almost like wonder. He extended one massive hand, claws carefully sheathed, and the spotted cub reached out to tap his palm with one tiny paw, before retreating back into his fabric fortress. "This is Kep," Oxmoon said quietly. "He is my sister's 3rd offspring. The one in your hood is Umbi, my nephew, firstborn of the clutch. And Lottie, on your shoulder, is my niece, second-born, and wisest of the three. "Nice to meet you all officially," Kimber said. "Because what else do you say when you're being formally introduced to the alien children currently colonizing your hoodie?" "I'm Kimber. I fix things. And apparently, I'm a nap spot now." Lottie chose that moment to wake fully, her large eyes blinking open and focusing on Oxmoon with what could only be described as recognition. But instead of leaping toward her uncle like Kimber expected, she pressed closer to Kimber's head and made a soft, uncertain trill. Oxmoon's ears flattened against his skull. It was a subtle movement, but the reaction from the other Uxmori security personnel who had quietly joined the group was immediate. They exchanged glances, mandibles clicking in what Kimber was starting to recognize as their version of murmured conversation. "I don't understand," Oxmoon said, and for the first time, his voice carried something other than authority. It carried confusion, and, underneath that, something that sounded almost like pain. "Cubs do not approach strangers. They fear unknown scents. They trust only pack, only blood. This is not possible." Umbi, apparently tired of being discussed, climbed out of Kimber's hood and perched on top of her head, his weight pressing down on her skull like a very warm, very alive hat. He chirped at Oxmoon, a long string of sounds that had the cadence of speech, even if Kimber couldn't understand the words. One of the Uxmori guards translated, his voice hesitant. "He says, the soft pelt does not smell like fear. She smells like home metal and quiet song. She was warm. He was tired. So he slept." "The soft pelt," Kimber repeated. "Is that me? Am I the soft pelt?" "Your outer covering," Oxmoon gestured at her hoodie. "They have not encountered such material before. Our garments are woven from thermal silk and combat fiber. Nothing so pliant." "It's just a hoodie," Kimber said. "Standard human comfort wear. Nothing special." But Oxmoon was shaking his head slowly, that look of wonder creeping back into his expression. "You misunderstand. It is not the garment. It is you. Cubs sense intent, sense safety, at a primal level. They do not approach those who might harm them. They do not sleep near those they do not trust. And they certainly do not." He gestured at Umbi, who was now grooming Kimber's hair with his tongue, which was simultaneously adorable and slightly alarming. "They do not claim territory on strangers." "Territory," Kimber said flatly. "I'm territory now." "You are pack," Oxman corrected. "They have marked you as safe, as family." Commander Pollux stepped forward, and Kimber recognized the expression on his face. It was his diplomatic expression, the one that meant he was about to turn a disaster into an opportunity. She'd seen him use it during trade negotiations when the Krellian ambassador had accidentally insulted the Thoran delegation's religious customs. This was not going to end well for her personal life. She could feel it. "Huntmaster," Pollux said smoothly, "perhaps this situation, unusual as it is, presents an opportunity for cultural exchange. Clearly, there is something about human presence that your cubs find comforting, something we might learn from." "You want to study my people's children," Oxmoon said, his tone dropping several degrees below freezing. "No, no," Pollux backpedaled quickly. "I'm suggesting that perhaps Kimber here, with your permission and supervision, could spend some supervised time with the cubs. Help us understand why this connection occurred. It could be valuable for future human-Uxmori relations." Kimber opened her mouth to protest, to point out that she had actual work to do and absolutely zero childcare experience with human children, let alone alien ones. But before she could speak, Kep climbed fully out of her pocket and launched himself at Oxmoon with a happy trill. The huntmaster caught him automatically, cradling the cub against his chest, but Kep immediately began squirming, reaching back toward Kimber with both paws outstretched, making sounds that were unmistakably distressed. Lottie and Umbi joined in, their chirps taking on a plaintive quality that made something in Kimber's chest tighten uncomfortably. Oxmoon looked at his nephew, then at Kimber, then back at Kep, who was now actively climbing over his uncle's shoulder in an attempt to reach the human. The huntmaster's expression cycled through about 6 different emotions in 3 seconds, finally landing on something that looked like resignation mixed with reluctant respect. "This has never happened before," he said quietly. "In all our generations, in all our history, cubs do not bond with outsiders. They barely tolerate unfamiliar pack members." He gently detached Kep from his armor and, with visible reluctance, held him out toward Kimber. "But I am not fool enough to ignore what my eyes show me." Kimber accepted Kep, who immediately dove back into her pocket with a satisfied churr, and she found herself meeting Oxmoon's gaze with sudden understanding. This wasn't easy for him. This went against everything his culture understood about child-rearing and safety and trust. "I'll take care of them," she heard herself say. "I mean, I don't really know what I'm doing, but I won't let anything happen to them." "See that you don't," Oxmoon replied, but there was no threat in his voice. Just a warning, and underneath that, something that might have been hope. Because if human pack bonding extends to our cubs, if there is wisdom in your softness that we have forgotten, then perhaps we have much to learn from your species. Or, Kimber said, shifting under the weight of 3 alien children who had apparently adopted her, maybe they just really like my hoodie. Umbi chirped in agreement from his position on her head, and despite everything, despite the security team and the diplomatic incident and the complete upheaval of her normal routine, Kimber felt herself smile. This was going to be so much paperwork. Kimber had imagined, in her naive optimism, that supervised time with the cubs meant maybe an hour here or there, closely monitored, probably in some sterile conference room with a dozen diplomats taking notes. She had imagined wrong. What it actually meant was that she now had 3 Uxmori cubs waiting outside her quarters every morning at 0600, chirping excitedly the moment her door opened, ready to help with her maintenance rounds. And by help, she meant climb into her hoodie, make adorable nuisance sounds at anything shiny, and occasionally attempt to eat her tools. It had been 6 days. 6 days of trying to repair plasma conduits while explaining to Umbi why he couldn't chew on the power couplings. 6 days of Lottie sitting on her shoulder, observing everything with those huge luminous eyes, and occasionally offering chirped commentary that the translation devices struggled to interpret. 6 days of fishing, kept out of access panels he had no business being inside. The station's population had noticed. Oh, they had definitely noticed. "Is that Kimber?" a Thoran merchant had whispered to his companion that morning, watching her walk past with 3 alien cubs hanging off her like particularly committed accessories. "The maintenance worker with the Uxmori young?" "The pack tender," his companion had corrected, using a term Kimber definitely hadn't authorized. "I heard she speaks their hunting tongue. I heard she survived a challenge trial. I heard she's actually part Uxmori, genetically modified," someone else chimed in. Kimber had kept walking, pretending she couldn't hear them, while Umbi made rude gestures at the gossipers from his perch on her head. She was teaching him bad habits. She probably should have felt guilty about that. The real shift happened on day 8, during what Kimber had thought would be a routine meeting with Oxmoon to discuss the cubs' progress. She'd arrived at the Uxmori embassy quarters with her 3 charges, expecting a quick debriefing. Instead, she found herself facing 6 adult uxmori, all standing in a semicircle, all staring at her with varying expressions of desperation. "They don't sleep," one of them said without preamble. Her name was Likma, and she had the bearing of someone who hadn't rested properly in weeks. "Our cubs. They haven't slept through a full cycle since we left the homeworld. They startle at every sound. They hide in corners. The station physician says their stress hormones are dangerously elevated." Another uxmori, younger, stepped forward. "My daughter won't eat. She takes one bite and retreats to her den. She's losing weight. I don't know how to help her." Kimber looked at Oxmoon, who stood to the side, his expression carefully neutral. "You want me to what, exactly? Babysit more cubs?" "We want to understand," Oxman said quietly. "What you do that we cannot. What makes our offspring feel safe with you when they fear everything else in this metal sky nest?" Umbi, sensing the tension, climbed down from Kimber's shoulder and approached Likma, chirping softly. The female Uxmori looked down at him with such raw longing that Kimber felt it like a physical blow. But when Likma reached for him, Umbi skittered backward, pressing against Kimber's leg. "I don't have special training," Kimber said, uncomfortable with being the center of so much attention. "I just treat them like kids. Talk to them. Let them explore. Make sure they don't kill themselves doing stupid stuff." "Stupid stuff?" Oxmoon repeated. "Yeah, like when Kep tried to climb into the waste recycler yesterday, or when Umbi decided the power coupling would make a good chew toy." Kimber gestured at the cubs, who were now investigating a decorative plant in the corner with intense fascination. "They're curious. They want to poke at things and figure out how stuff works. So I let them, within reason, and I explain what's dangerous and what isn't." "We do not permit cubs to explore unsupervised," Likma said. "It is unsafe. There are too many threats." "Sure, but they're with me. I'm supervising. And they're learning what's actually dangerous versus what's just new." Kimber crouched down as Lottie brought her a piece of the plant, offering it like a prize. "Good find, Lottie. That's a Krellian fern. Not for eating, but you can touch the leaves. See how they're soft?" Lottie chirped and carefully stroked the plant, her claws retracted, her posture relaxed and curious rather than fearful. The adult Uxmori watched this interaction like Kimber had just performed a magic trick. "How do you know our language?" the younger male asked. "You speak to them as if you understand their words." "I don't understand their words," Kimber admitted. "But tone is universal. Body language is universal. Lottie's ears go up when she's happy, down when she's scared. Umbi's tail does this little wiggle thing before he's about to do something reckless. Kep purrs louder when he's really content versus when he's just comfortable. You learn the signs." "We know these signs," Likma protested. "We are their parents, their pack. But they do not show us these behaviors anymore. They hide. They fear." Kimber stood, brushing plant debris off her knees, and made a decision that was probably going to consume her entire life. "Okay, bring them tomorrow. Your cubs. All of them. Meet me in Cargo Bay 5 at 0900. And bring whatever comfort items they like, toys, blankets, whatever." "You cannot possibly manage more than 3, Oxmoon said, but there was hope in his voice underneath the skepticism. "Guess we'll find out," Kimber replied, already mentally cataloging which section of the cargo bay would be safest for a herd of alien children. The next morning she arrived early to set up, moving crates to create a kind of obstacle course, testing each surface to make sure it could support cub weight without collapsing. She'd requisitioned some soft thermal blankets from Station Supply ignoring the quartermaster's questions about why a maintenance tech needed comfort materials. At 08:55, the Yuxmori delegation arrived. 8 adult warriors carrying 5 additional cubs in various states of distress. One was mewling pitifully. 2 were clinging to their parents with claws fully extended. Another was so tense that Kimber could see her shaking from across the bay. The 5th was completely withdrawn, eyes half closed, non-responsive to his father's attempts at comfort. Umbi, Kep, and Lottie immediately ran forward, chirping excitedly at the newcomers. The reaction was immediate. All 5 stressed cubs perked up, ears swiveling toward the sound, eyes widening with sudden interest. "Okay," Kimber said, addressing the adult Uxmori. "Here's how this works. You're going to stand over there, near the wall, far enough that the cubs can't easily reach you, but close enough that they know you're there. And you're not going to interfere unless someone's actively dying." "You want us to abandon our children," one of the mothers said, her voice sharp. "I want you to let them come to me on their own terms," Kimber corrected. "Because right now, they're feeding off your stress. You're scared, they're scared. It's a loop. We need to break it." Oxmun, to his credit, understood immediately. He nodded to the others and moved to the designated area. The other adults followed reluctantly, setting their cubs down on the deck. For a long moment, nothing happened. 8 cubs sat in various positions, some curled into defensive balls, others wide-eyed and trembling. Umbi, Kep, and Lottie circled them, chirping encouragement, but the newcomers didn't respond. Kimber sat down on the deck, cross-legged, and pulled out her data pad. She started playing music, something instrumental and calm, then proceeded to completely ignore the cubs while she pretended to review maintenance logs. It took 15 minutes, 15 long, quiet minutes, where the only sounds were the music and the occasional chirp from her regular trio. Then, slowly, one of the new cubs, the one who'd been shaking, crept forward. She moved in fits and starts, freezing every few steps. But she was moving toward Kimber rather than away. Kimber didn't look up, didn't acknowledge, just kept scrolling through her fake work, humming along to the music. The cub reached her knee and stopped. Kimber could feel those huge eyes studying her, cataloging threat levels, trying to understand what this strange soft pelt was about. After a moment, tiny claws extended, and the cub began to climb. She was heavier than the others, older maybe, and her movements were jerky with residual fear. But she climbed, reaching Kimber's shoulder and perching there like Lottie often did. When Kimber still didn't react, didn't grab or startle, the cub's breathing began to slow. Her claws retracted. And then, tentatively, she started to purr. That broke the dam. Within 20 minutes, Kimber had 8 cubs distributed across her person like she was a climbing gym. The withdrawn male had discovered her hood and was peering out at the world with newfound interest. 2 others had claimed her lap. One was investigating her toolkit with Umbi's enthusiastic assistance. The rest were draped over various parts of her torso, purring in a harmony that sounded like a chorus of tiny engines. The adult Uxmori stood against the wall, absolutely transfixed. Likma had her hand over her mouth, and Kimber was pretty sure the hardened warrior was crying. "What do you do?" one of the fathers asked, his voice rough. "What magic is this?" "No magic," Kimber said, gently redirecting Kep from trying to disassemble her communicator. "Just time, and a really, really comfortable hoodie." But she knew it was more than that. She could see it in the way the cubs were relaxing, their bodies losing that coiled spring tension, their eyes brightening with curiosity instead of fear. These children had been stressed, constantly alert, never allowed to just be kids. The political fallout from what the station population had started calling the Great Cub Incident was both predictable and utterly absurd. Within 2 weeks, Kimber had been summoned to no fewer than 8 separate diplomatic meetings, interviewed by 3 different news outlets, and had somehow become the unofficial ambassador for human Uxmori childhood relations, a position she was pretty sure didn't exist until someone made it up specifically for her. Commander Pollux was living his best diplomatic life, turning Kimber's accidental nanny service into a station-wide initiative for interspecies childhood development. He'd requisitioned an entire section of the lower cargo bays, designated them as cultural exchange zones, and was currently fielding requests from 6 other species who wanted to understand why their children seemed equally drawn to the human soft pelt method. Kimber just wanted to fix conduits in peace. But peace, apparently, was no longer on the menu. "They're coming today," Oxman informed her one morning, finding her in her usual workspace with 11 cubs now, because apparently word had spread and 2 more families had begged her to help their struggling offspring. The Matriarch Council. They arrive at 1400 hours. Kimber looked up from where she was teaching Umbi and 3 other cubs basic tool safety, which mostly involved explaining why plasma torches were not toys, no matter how pretty the flame looked. Define they. The 3 eldest matriarchs of the Uxmori homeworld, Oxmoon said, and his tone carried the kind of weight that suggested this was the Uxmori equivalent of the president, the pope, and a Supreme Court justice showing up to her workspace simultaneously. They wish to observe your methods, to understand what you have done to our children. I gave them naps and snacks, Kimber said. That's literally it. I'm not doing anything revolutionary. But she was, and she knew it. The 11 cubs in her care had transformed over the past month. They played now, really played, wrestling and exploring and making the kinds of joyful chaos that young creatures should make. They slept through full cycles. They ate without coaxing. And most importantly, they'd started approaching their own parents again, bringing them treasures from their explorations, seeking comfort when needed, rather than hiding from perceived threats. The change in the adult Uxmori had been equally dramatic. Laikma had stopped looking like she was 3 seconds from collapse. The younger fathers had started asking Kimber questions about play behaviors, about how to distinguish between distress and excitement, about why letting cubs make small mistakes was actually beneficial for their development. She'd accidentally revolutionized an entire species' parenting philosophy, and she was still trying to process that. The matriarchs arrived precisely at 1400 hours, flanked by an honor guard that made Oxmoon's security detail look casual. They were magnificent, ancient, with fur that had gone silver-white with age, and eyes that held the kind of wisdom that came from surviving centuries. The eldest, who introduced herself as Ikpira, stood at least 3 meters tall and radiated authority like a furnace radiated heat. Kimber, covered in cubs as usual, with Umbi on her head, Lottie on her shoulder, and Kep stuffed in. Her pocket decided that standing up to greet them would just result in a cascade of complaining cubs, so she stayed seated and offered a wave. "Matriarchs," she said. "Welcome to Cargo Bay 5, also known as Chaos Central. Watch your step. There's cubs everywhere." Ikpira stared at her for a long moment, then did something Kimber hadn't expected. She laughed, a sound like distant thunder rolling across mountains, rich and genuine. "The pack tender has no ceremony in her bones. I appreciate this." The other 2 matriarchs, slightly younger but no less imposing, moved through the cargo bay with careful steps, observing the cubs who were engaged in various activities. Some were building towers from crates under the supervision of two older cubs. Others were investigating a collection of safe mechanical parts Kimber had gathered. 3 were napping in a nest of thermal blankets, curled around each other in peaceful sleep. "This is not possible," one of the matriarchs murmured. "Cubs do not mix clutches. They do not share territory with unfamiliar young." "Yeah, they told me that too," Kimber said, gently removing Umbi from her head as he was starting to groom her hair again, which tickled. "Turns out, give them a safe space and some gentle supervision. They figure out the social stuff pretty quick." Ikpira crouched down, bringing herself closer to Kimber's level, and her gaze was intense enough to make Kimber's survival instincts wake up and pay attention. "Do you understand what you have done, human? Made your children less stressed?" Kimber offered. "You have exposed a weakness in our people that we did not know we possessed," Ikpira said, but there was no anger in her voice. "We are warriors. We are hunters. We pride ourselves on strength, on survival, on raising offspring who can face any threat. But in becoming strong, we forgot how to be gentle. We forgot that young ones need softness before they need steel." She gestured at the cubs, at the way they moved freely, confidently, with curiosity instead of fear. "Our children were drowning in our strength. We held them so tightly to keep them safe that we suffocated their spirits. And it took a human, wearing a garment made for comfort rather than combat, to show us what we had lost." Kimber felt something tight in her chest at those words. "You didn't lose it," she said quietly. "It's still there. I've seen how Likma looks at her daughter, how Oxmun checks on Umbi every evening. The love is there. You just needed permission to be soft with it." "Permission," Ikpira repeated, tasting the word. "Yes, perhaps that is precisely what we needed." The third matriarch approached, carrying something wrapped in shimmering fabric that seemed to shift colors in the light. She knelt before Kimber with the kind of grace that suggested the movement was ceremonial, significant. "The council has deliberated," she said. "We wish to bestow upon you the title of Pack Kin, an honor given to those who have proven themselves essential to the survival and well-being of Uxmori young. You would be the first non-Uxmori to receive this designation." "I'm just doing what makes sense," Kimber protested, but Umbi chirped excitedly, and Kep popped his head out of her pocket to see what was happening. "Precisely," Ikapira said. "You do what makes sense, what feels right, rather than what tradition dictates. This is wisdom we must learn." The wrapped bundle turned out to be a cloak, and when they unfurled it, Kimber caught her breath. It was woven from fabric that felt like water and looked like starlight, in deep blues and silvers that matched Uxmori fur patterns, but the most striking feature was the hood, large and deep, clearly designed with a specific purpose in mind. "For napping cubs," Ikpira said with a slight smile, "since yours seems to require constant reinforcement." Despite herself, Kimber laughed. They'd made her official napping equipment. This was her life now. The ceremony was brief but meaningful, the matriarchs speaking words in their own language that the translators rendered as promises of alliance, of family, of bonds that transcended species. When they placed the cloak around her shoulders, every cub in the cargo bay stopped what they were doing and chirped in unison, a sound of approval that echoed off the walls. 6 months later, Kimber was elbow-deep in a malfunctioning coolant system, her new cloak thoroughly stained with grease, while 5 adolescent Uxmori watched her work with intense focus. Umbi, Kep, and Lottie were bigger now, nearly half her height, but they still insisted on being near her during their learning rotations. The coupling here, she explained, pointing with her wrench, connects to the primary flow regulator. You mess this up, and the whole section overheats. So we're careful, we double-check, and we always have backup containment ready. Why not use automated systems? Umbi asked, his voice deeper now but still carrying that curious lilt. Because automated systems break, and when they do, someone needs to know how to fix them manually. Kimber tightened a bolt and nodded in satisfaction. Always understand the basics before you rely on the fancy stuff. She felt a familiar tap on her back and turned to find a small creature, not Uxmori, with 6 legs and crystalline fur, looking up at her with huge, multifaceted eyes. Behind it stood what was clearly its parent, a member of the Kixian delegation that had arrived last week. The parent made a chittering sound that the translator rendered as hopeful inquiry. They said you help young ones learn, not fear. Could you help mine? Kimber looked at the small Kixian, at her 5 adolescent Uxmori students, at the cloak that had become her uniform, and at Commander Pollux in the distance, already making notes for whatever diplomatic initiative would come from this. She sighed, smiled, and crouched down to the small creature's level. Okay, kiddo. You want to learn about coolant systems? Fair warning, it might involve you falling asleep in my hood at some point. Seems to be a universal constant. The Kixian chirped excitedly, and immediately started climbing her leg. Umbi snorted, a sound that was definitely laughter. The pack tender collects all the young ones. Someone has to, Kimber replied, supporting the small Kixian as it settled into her cloak's hood with happy trills. Might as well be the one with the really good hoodie. And somewhere in the administrative offices, Commander Pollux updated her official title to Special Cultural Liaison for Interspecies Developmental Relations, which was a fancy way of saying she'd become the universe's most unlikely kindergarten teacher, armed with tools, terrible jokes, and a magical cloak specifically designed for nap time. She still fixed pipes. She just did it now, with an ever-growing collection of young aliens who had decided that learning trades was infinitely more interesting when the teacher let you sleep in her hood afterward. The galaxy, it turned out, ran on practical compassion and really comfortable outerwear. Who knew?